Welcome back to the Decoupage series. In this episode, I'll be talking about how to paint the shells and how to glue on the napkins. Before you start painting, make sure the shell is clean and free of any debris. I'm going to use a white chalk paint, but you can use any type of white acrylic paint you have on hand. Personally, I like the chalk paint because I find that it gives better coverage. I'm going to start by applying a thin layer of paint, making sure to smooth it out and eliminate brush strokes as much as possible. You can use a foam brush if you prefer, but I personally like working with a regular brush. After you apply the first layer, let it dry completely before adding the second coat. If you don't, you risk smudging or lifting the first layer of paint. To speed up the drying process, you can use a small fan. After the first layer is dry, I like to apply a second coat. This step is optional, but here is my tip. If you are going to cover the entire shell with a napkin, one coat of paint is usually fine. However, if you are only applying pieces of the napkin, adding a second coat will make the final finish look much better. And just like before, carefully smooth out the paint to help eliminate any brush strokes. And for comparison, the shell on the left has 2 coats of paint, while the shell on the right only has 1. The difference is pretty visible. Now that the shells are prepped, we can start the decoupaging. We're going to need Mod Podge, and there are several options available depending on the look you are going for. I have a matte finish, a glossy finish, and a super glossy finish here. I like to use either the glossy finish or a super glossy finish. You are also going to need a soft bristle brush. Let's start with an easy project first. It's much easier to apply a smaller piece of napkin to the shell than to cover the entire shell, so that's what we are going to begin with. Apply a thin layer of Mod Podge to the shell, then place your piece of napkin on top. Gently press down to smooth out all the wrinkles. You can use a piece of plastic wrap to make sure your finger accidentally doesn't lift or tear the napkin while you are trying to smooth out the wrinkles. Once you smooth out the wrinkles, apply a top coat of Mod Podge and let it dry. Make sure the layer is thin, as applying it too thick can leave a murky look. For the best result, it is better to apply several thin layers rather than one thick coat. As you work on the shells, you can wrap your brush in plastic wrap to prevent the glue from drying onto the bristles. Next up, I'm going to show you how to cover the entire shell with a napkin. This is much easier to do on a flatter surface like this scallop shell, compared to more curved shell such as a clamshell. I really wanted to use this napkin with the pumpkin design, but it's just not going to work. The pumpkin really needs to be centered, and there isn't enough napkin to fully cover the shell. Also, as you can see, the design is cut off, so this type of napkin isn't a good choice for covering an entire shell. But this blue flower napkin is perfect. First, we need to separate the layers, since we only need the top layer of the napkin. Then I'm going to decide which section of the napkin to use and tear off a piece that's large enough to cover the entire shell. I am going to apply a thin layer of Mod Podge to the entire shell before placing the napkin on it. Then I'll gently smooth out the napkin, trying to eliminate wrinkles as much as possible by working from the inside out. If I were working with a larger shell or a more curved one, I would apply the Mod Podge in stages. I'll demonstrate this in a little bit when I work on the clamshell. Once you are done smoothing out the wrinkles, remove the excess napkin by gently tearing it off. Then apply a top coat of Mod Podge and set it aside to dry. Now, because the clamshell has more of a curve to it, I'm going to work in sections. I'll apply Mod Podge only to the bottom part first, then place the napkin on top, making sure the blue flower is centered where I want it. From there, I'll smooth out as many wrinkles as I can. It's hard to eliminate all of them, so just do the best you can. Also make sure there is enough Mod Podge along the edges so the napkin doesn't peel off. Once one section is done, I'll move on to the next. But first I'll cut a small slit into the napkin. This helps it fit into the curved top of the shell. I will also trim away some of the napkin so it doesn't get too bunched up. Just be careful not to cut away too much. It's better for the napkin to overlap than to end up with an empty bare spot. Because the top section is folded over, I find it easier to remove the excess napkin after the glue has dried. If you do it now, it's very easy to accidentally pull the napkin off the shell. Once everything is dry, you can finish tearing off the excess napkin. Check to make sure all the edges are glued down, and if not, apply more Mod Podge. Then apply top coat and let it completely dry. Make sure to apply the Mod Podge in thin layers. Applying it too thick can cause the surface to look cloudy. I want to show you a slight variation of the technique I actually prefer, but it's a bit messier and requires a little more care. First, apply a thin layer of Mod Podge. Just like before, place the napkin on top, making sure it's positioned exactly where you want it, and gently press it down. Then apply top coat right away and use your fingers to lightly glide over the surface to smooth out the wrinkles. If you use too much Mod Podge, the napkin can tear easily, and if you use too little, your fingers won't slide smoothly. You'll need to find a happy medium. I recommend trying both methods and seeing which one works best for you. There is one more step I like to do before adding the finishing touches: removing any frayed edges of the napkin. You can use fine grit sandpaper or a nail file for this. I personally prefer using a nail file, but for shells with nooks and curves, like this scallop shell, Sandpaper can be easier to maneuver and get into those tight spots. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss the next episode, make sure to subscribe. In the next episode, we'll be adding all the finishing touches. Until next time, happy crafting!